Are you listening?
This is the Rob Scott Show.
Damn.
I mean, really, like, if we're not trying to change the world, what are we doing?
Yeah.
Welcome back to the Rob Scott Show. I am Rob. I'm here with Sarah, and I can't wait to do this talk today. What's going on, Sarah?
Hi, Rob. It's good to see you. It's good to see you
see
today.
Yay.
I am excited for this episode, as always. This can just be our running theme. Sarah's excited for the episode. But I wanted to talk about something, kind of a general topic that might take us through a couple episodes. But I think a really good place to start, since we've been talking about the story of self and the fundamental shift and kind of understanding the unconscious and conscious mechanisms of our meaning.
Yeah.
How that kind of ties into relationships in general and kind of what a lot of us are trying to get better at, communication and romantic relationships, parenting relationships, but kind of starting with relating in general, because we've talked a lot about our own relationship with our mind, with our feelings, with our behaviors. But, often we're trying to maximize this so we can relate better, in my opinion.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So I love that. That's an awesome topic. Let's like put relating into a place.
Yes.
First off, I think that people are often like relationships are such a huge part of the whole thing, right? Like of everything, right? Where everything is really challenged by relationships. There's a lot of very cool structure that we'll I hope talk about right here that can explain and help with relationships, but they're super duper important. There's no question, but let's give them a place, right? Because we've talked in the past about the sort of the stack that your nervous system is up to, right? And at the very base level, you've got, sensation, somewhere above that, you've got your perception, like literally your attention of what you're paying attention to. Then we get into emotions and the heuristics of those sort of automatic, the way they kind of arise. Other side of that is how you're thinking and your meaning making. And then all of that is almost, kind of state related or could be present related. Like that's a lot of the things that are like going on in you prior to even behaving, right? So then we have behaving on top of that. Like all those things are stacking together to inform behaving. Like, should I walk this way or go there or run after that thing or whatever? And then all of that is, if all of that is you, then that system of you is trying to relate to others that are all dealing with their levels of those things, right? And so in the collective, we have this, we're all bouncing off each other. Ideas are bouncing off each other. Behaviors are bouncing off each other, all that. And like, that is the whole next level of complexity of being alive and what we're doing. And so we often talk about self and sort of that
Right.
more granular, what you control part of things, so that, because if that's not running well, if some of those basic systems aren't running well, like if you have epilepsy and you literally can't manage your emotion and your brain's firing in a way that's not going to lead to being able to think or feel or have emotions that are healthy, all that stuff, that's going to make anything above it difficult, right? And so we want to get those basic thoughts, feelings, emotions, behaviors down. And then so much of that is in service so that we can be better at relating, right? That we can be.
Yeah. And I actually want to jump in right there, because I think when I first thought about like, oh, what kind of is interesting about this, I went to relationships because that feels really obvious to me. But then thinking about kind of this, like you said, this kind of stack of who we are and what we're doing and how we're thinking and feeling and behaving, is that relating doesn't always, it's not always in context with another person. And that there's actually, in my opinion, and from what I've talked about with you, I would love to hear your thoughts on relating to kind of the story of self, because we know that that's a model now that we can take on or take off.
Yeah.
There's also a relationship to, isness that we've been saying, consciousness, sensations. And it's almost like I was thinking about how if we get better at relating to the self-world model and relating to, leaving the self-world model, relating to like our senses or something like that, like eventually that's going to help us probably relate to other like other people. But like you're saying, it's complex because they're coming with all the same stack that you just named. So I was just like, oh, there might be some interesting things around just the ability to relate or connect, or I'm not sure what the right word is
Yeah,
or
it's
interact.
such a really rich beginning to this whole conversation. And so I feel like we're starting in the deep end for sure, right? This is
Typical.
I mean, we could start with like, well, here's how to have people like you better, or here's how to be
Yeah.
persuasive, or here are the right things to say at a certain time. You know, there are all these shortcuts and quick tips to better relationships with other people and all that kind of stuff. But I'm so happy we're kind of right in the deep end. Let's talk about a couple of those different relationships that you talked about. So number one, part of the reason that if we are talking about relating with other people, part of that complexity is that at some of those levels of those internal stacks, we're just not good at controlling them or even knowing what's going on. So thinking, as an example, is one where we're often doing all this extra thinking and we're not aware that we're doing it, and it clouds reality in really important ways, and that messes us up. But we're also then dealing with everyone else who is doing that also, right? So this is why this is like a foundational problem with being human. And that's why, like, when that's not working well for you, if you're not good at that, it's going to be really hard just to run your own brain. And then it's going to be really hard to, be trustworthy or trust others, or not notice when you're doing this selfish thing and self-justifying it and kind of lying to yourself about it and doing all these like escape games. And then at a bigger sense, as we group together, corporations start behaving that way. Different, political ideologies start behaving that way. Nations behave that way, right? So we end up with these scales of grouping problems of collective selves coming together dysfunctionally that is, at the heart of all the challenges that we see in the world. So if we go like way deep prior to that, this idea of just relating to something different, if we don't even know that we're not only a self, okay? And what I mean by that is a psychological self, right? If we don't know that that what we're talking about a psychological self is actually not even just a separate self, it's a self world model together. So, one thing is, can you see the difference between being in isness or being with your sensation, and how that is different than when you are modeling self and thinking about things and judging and having goals and feeling like you're in time and all that stuff? If there's nothing there, like if those two states don't make sense to you, like being in experience versus being in thought, then this won't make sense, right? But that would be maybe this very, very core foundational relationship between thinking and not thinking, self and not self, time versus isness, right? That's that kind of basic level of like, can we get a little bit more consciousness around those different dimensions of being alive? Okay.
Definitely.
So then within self, because self is for all of us, I don't care how much you meditate, I don't care how, I don't care if you're the Buddha or whatever, the mind very automatically and very well comes online to do this modeling thing. It does this thinking thing quite automatically and quite often. Once that's online, can you start to parse within yourself that, and even though these are actually in the same model, the parts of it that are you versus the world, right? So can you be really clear about your relationship of the self that is not the same as that other self over there, or even that goal that you have, or even that value that yourself might have in the moment? Can you see that normally those are perceived kind of all at one time, but they can be pulled apart and noticed as different aspects of the same thing? And so within that, you end up with a different level of relating between self and world that is very different, but still quite internal, right? Is that, I want to pause there and ask you if that makes sense. Does that?
Yeah, I mean, and it's good because I was going on the kind of the assumptive platform that, that we understand that there's a difference between being in the self world model and being able to leave it, which is often kind of the main concept we talked around having the fundamental shift, is that realization that you can, all this meaning can go away, and you can still have this like very sincere and intense connection.
And here's another way to talk about that, because a lot of times people are we just get really captured by, well, of course I'm always a self, it's me, like, what are you talking about? I'm never not here. And what I'm trying to elucidate for people, or just make more conscious, make us all more aware that there are different parts of that, and the self-conscious psychological part of you is a part of the model, and the model is a part of what consciousness is capable of, right? So there's like consciousness itself is potentially bigger and wider than the modeling that you're doing.
Right.
And when I say consciousness, maybe that's not even going to make total sense, because I'm actually talking about the whole function of your unconscious and your consciousness, right? So when I'm not saying that you're going to, in your human sense, be fully aware of all those things. In fact, so much of this is going on outside of your awareness. So it's as if there's this platform of potential of thinking that's happening. You're aware of some of it, you're not aware of some of it. And within that, you end up with this self-model that is like the easiest heuristic to come back to relate everything in the world to, and to relate all your goals to, and to relate your preferences to. And so that this is the model that is your history, your memory, that comes online, that goes, I am this. And this is like how we don't have to keep rethinking everything all the time. We end up with this model or heuristic of, this is who I am, this is what I know, this is what I care about, etc. But that's not always online. It may not be online while you're sleeping. It may not be online if you're super duper whacked out on drugs. It may not be online in different ways you think and experience. And even when you're just with your breath, I'm going to suggest that it can dissolve and not be there moment by moment. So now we have this different relationship between not self and self. Even when we are self, we can start to then pull apart, okay, what is this self model care about? Like, because those things aren't, even if they're a bit of an illusion, it doesn't mean they don't matter, right? They totally matter to us. They're totally what we're about. They really are our identity, et cetera. So now,
can I just interrupt you really quick? Because that was perfect, because that's kind of what I was asking about. Is, to me, when I think about relating, I instantly go relationships, right?
Yes.
Human to human.
Right.
And when I was thinking about it, relating actually starts with the relationship to self, which, as you just described, can be different than many people might realize, right? Mm-hmm. Where you can actually relate very deeply to self, or relate to not, being stuck within the self. And just to even to make it less kind of ethereal, like, think about the self that when you're at work, that's a self that you relate. You're like, I'm an employee. When you're at home and you're a parent, I'm in mom. When your kids go to bed, your partner. So even within self, we can relate to self in very different ways. And that, I realize, is where we're not always good at relating. Mm-hmm. And then, but we don't see it, right? Because we think, oh, well, what's wrong with my partner? What's wrong with my boss? What's wrong with my friend? And we don't see that, like, we don't even have the capacity to relate to our different self in that way. And I found that to be very interesting.
Totally.
As far as the relating aspect. So
I don't know if I'm going to do this well yet. I'm trying to do slides because I think this will be meaningful and I can really get it right. I'm hoping it'll be in the training and all the different stuff. When we're in our deepest work with people, one of the main things that we do, and it might be the most known thing that we do a lot of other really important things, but this thing matters. We actually find these unconscious lenses, which are always about that self-world model. Very often they're about self, right? And they often sound like, I'm not enough, or, I'll never be wealthy, or I don't deserve money, or nobody loves me, or, those types of things. What's interesting, when we teach visually lenses, you get this sense of like how I can have a lens out here and it's altering what I'm seeing. And we've used examples of, like, somebody comes in the room and you have a lens that they're a bad person. And so you, even though they may not be doing something bad in the moment, your lens is adding that meaning on. You take that in to be real, and then you experience them again as that, even whether they were or were not bad in that moment, right? That's your lens doing it. So that all seems obvious, but what that kind of implies, and what normally happens to us as we're being these different selves that we're not kind of aware that we're being, is that the self is the part that seems to be doing the looking, right? And so it's obvious to go, oh, I have a lens about that mean old dad of mine, or that friend that did me wrong, or whatever. Those become obvious because we're used to looking out here at the world. But the self-world model is the part of the creation of the looker and all the things the looker cares about, and then the things that are being looked at, right? And it's that combo of self-world together that is the challenge of life, right? That's like what we're trying to navigate well. So the lenses about yourself are not things that we're used to looking at. It's almost like, you know, in the way it's like the cave allegory, like we're not looking in the right direction, right? We're not, we're looking out at the images out here of self that we're projecting, but we're not really that good at looking at yourself. So when you can meaningfully go in and start to affect some of those self-based lenses, it's it's incredibly helpful, because it actually changes the looker, right? It actually changes that feature of you. It can change some of those values. It can change some of these beliefs, but it is not our default, right? That is not like for any old regular person bebopping around. It is not natural to look that way, because it's literally not what we see. Like I've never quite literally, I've never seen my own face without a mirror or a camera or something else. You've seen my face more than I have. Right. Because I'm always looking out. And so the self psychologically that gets created underneath is doing that too.
Well, I think that's a great analogy, because that's, I mean, another easier way to kind of think about that is if you've ever had a friend or, you know, a therapist, or this is why people work with coaches, is to have somebody see something about you that you can't see. And even if I have a mirror, like you said, like I look at myself through a mirror, I can look at one thing at a time. Like I can't, you know, circle around my own head and be like, oh, well, that's the full picture. And so, yeah, that's a great point.
Really? Have you ever tried to cut your hair in a mirror?
No.
Well, it's funny, but it's all backwards. Like it's just, it doesn't, it's until you've done it a bunch of times, it doesn't make sense. And it's the way you want to move your hand is not the way that it's actually moving. So even the reflection of ourself is distorted, right? It's not an authentic look like another would see us, right? So when we're, and this is going to maybe relate up into how we talk about relating with others, because as we're modeling them and thinking about them, we're seeing them very differently than they're perceiving, or not even perceiving themselves, because they're putting it on us. And just to jump to something that's always really interesting there, we end up, you know, over considering how we think they think when we don't even know how they think. Then we change our behavior not based on anything real, but something we've imagined. And, you know, then we're changing, which is kind of faking, because it's not natural. Now it's not how we wanted to be. We're faking into something that's based on an imagination about someone else. Like none of it is anywhere near reality. Quite often we're way off base. So another thing, just as we're talking about all these different slices, two other interesting ways to talk about self is there is the I part of self, which is the I have these goals, I have these desires, you know, don't you know, I'm going to accomplish these things, right? The subject of us. And then we have the me, which is the object of us, right? So the me is the thing that got hurt by you, like you hurt me, right? The me, the I is the part of me that will look at myself, but it doesn't see the I, it kind of sees the me, right? It sees the object that was mistreated, or the object that got victimized, or the object that didn't do a good enough job, or the object that whatever. And so even within that self model, without even the world part of it, we still have these different dimensions of how we're flipping back and forth between I and me, and they're not quite the same, right?
And we're not always conscious when we're doing that.
Almost never, unless you're working on this and growing into this, we're almost never conscious of that, right? We're flipping back and forth all the time. And, you know, I will feel very differently, but then I'll report on the me kind of aspect of me to other people, because I'm wanting something to be known through persona or whatever. But I have very different authentic feelings underneath. You know, my friend and you know, our colleague in this space, Greg Henriquez, is somebody who's really innovated in this person-to-person justification space. Something that he pointed out that's really, really important is that the language move that was done at one point became almost consistently justifications, because what happens with other people is once I speak something out, I know that it has the possibility to be challenged and called not true, et cetera. So there's a ton of deep richness here, but because of that, that comes back and actually affects our self-consciousness about ourselves, because we're in any kind of relating that we're doing, that is such an important, he has something else called the influence matrix, right? Where we're constantly trying to make sure that we're safe and that we're perceived well and that we're popular and not a loser, that we have some form of power and ability and all these different things. And all of those motivations go into, in our, less healthy psychology, fake personas of bravado and all these different things.
Right.
And then private things that like won't be shared because I can't do that because I'm not intimate enough and all that. We'll get more into some of those dynamics and how we deal with others. But yeah.
Let me read you something that I wrote in kind of preparing for this. Is I wrote, we decide what we want by what others have. We decide how we feel by what others say. We decide how we behave by what others react to. And then I wrote, I think the game of being human is really the game of relating, which I know we kind of already said this, but I'll say it again in a new way, which led me to this idea of the conversation around relating is not necessarily about how you and I talk and how you and I communicate. And yes, there's things to get better there, but it's really like understanding that when the self-world model is online, and that's a creation of not only my own memories of relating with other people in those, what others have said, how they reacted and what they have, or, the standards that they set, but it's also like that's really where relating is to me. Like it totally changed my perspective of when I think of like relating in relationships. It's my relationship to that model that at any time in my day is different.
Yeah.
I'm a partner, I'm a employee, I'm a daughter-in-law, I'm all these things at different times. And so it's not, how are they, it's like, I love that you said the me and the I, right? Because it's often like, oh, why did they do that to me? Or, did they think of me? Or, how, and then the I of like all like the I wants and, whatever. And there is this, like, I'm very blind to it. And so I think, the relational issue, if there's an issue or a problem or a pain point, it's external. But like, I would say, or I would ask you what you think about this statement of like, maybe 99.9% of that is actually fixed internally because we never control external factors, people, places, weather, everything outside of. I just found that like such a different way to think about relating, and it kind of blew my mind.
It's a huge deal. There's so, like all of this, there's so much minutia that we could dive into and maybe we do a bunch of talks about this. Yes, so much of it is internal. And I mean, how much we always talk about modeling and doing all these things. I mean, imagine that to a very realistic degree, you are walking around in a simulation of reality more than you are directly touching reality. It doesn't mean that reality isn't there and affecting you, but your interpretation of reality is very limited in the way that humans can perceive it. It is very much created by both your literal perceptions and your mix of thoughts about it, et cetera.
Right.
And so I'm in a projection of my world. You're in a projection or a simulation of your world. We've talked in the past about how, okay, wow, we all have all these different perspectives alone, like just the perspective difference, right? Think about two absolutely identical objects, truly identical objects in every way we could imagine. As soon as I perceive them from any dimension, at least my perception of them is different because of the perspective, right? Like perspective alone changes the formula, right, of what's going on. And so we're each in our own, there's 7.5 or 8 billion simulations going on. And what it feels like, very much like we kind of don't pay attention to these different aspects of self. We are very external. We can see all the problems with them and over there and all that stuff, but we're not really always owning it or seeing what our own limits are. We all kind of mistake thinking that we're all living in reality, right? We're all seeing this same thing together. And even if you were perfectly aligned to see colors identically or whatever, you still have different perspectives, right? Like you and I are sharing a moment, but I'm experiencing you and you're experiencing me. That is not the same.
You alone in a room with a mirror have a different perspective than quote unquote reality.
Totally. I mean, was it Mike Myers with like camera one, camera two, camera one, camera two? Like it gets down to like very weird what are we talking about when we're talking about shared space? What are we talking about when we do this? And so back to those justification spaces, we are doing modeling, and I don't want to mess up Greg's work, because, you know, I'm going to ad lib here and add my own thoughts on this that he may or may not agree with. But like, for justification spaces to work, and Yuval Harari did a great thing about this in Sapiens, and how beliefs and religion allowed us to collaborate in different ways and all this different stuff. You know, a shared vision between people, a similar justification, right? An agreed upon reality as we describe it. So like, we're learning to hunt and we go, the antelope are over there, right? If we're going to disagree about that, we're not really sharing a justification space. We're saying,
Right.
no, it's not. Yes, it is. And then maybe we're fighting about it. Like, that's not cooperative. One of the huge advantages of humans are we can create these, what I literally call mind spaces together, or a justification space, where we're in agreement on what reality is. Okay. Now, if we get down into the nitty gritty of what reality really is, we're not very good at discerning how far off our realities are, right? Because we feel like everybody sees the same reality. That's kind of our default.
Right.
But when we can share what we value, what things mean, what's going on, all of a sudden you have a very powerful connection or group of people. But it's also tenuous in the fact that, like, as soon as somebody dissents from that, or they have a personal motivation so that they want to misrepresent and lie about something, or they stop believing it because they go, wow, I just had an experience and what we're all agreeing on didn't seem true to me, that starts to make the group fall apart. But people will stay committed to the ideas of the group, the justification space, and then start quite often arguing against real evidence and reality, right? Which is, we'll see groups that start to just, you know, disagree with science, or whatever the examples that we could use. And all of this is delusional on some level, right? It's all us living in these simulations. But to what degree can we get better at, you know, like, a certain religion may say, well, if everybody just had this same justification space, like if the entire world would take on, insert your religion here, we'd all be so great. And if that were true, that there's something to be said for that, right? Like, if we did all just agree on what our values were and what was important and all that stuff, you know, that is probably at the heart of, you know, making the world work in a better way.
Right.
But not because we're believing things that aren't true necessarily. What's going to be really important is, how can we start creating these justification spaces in a way where we can see the usefulness of the agreements, the facts as they're, you know, there and able to be had, and then wise choices when facts can't be known or agreed upon or whatever. And that level of maturity is not just believing in an ideology, that is getting better at relating in a much different way, right?
Right.
So yeah, so anyway.
Oh, I was just going to say, that's, you know, that's why I guess I put in quote, you know, the game of being human, because it's not okay. I'm going to take a different angle here. If you look at a couple that's having issues and they go to like a couples counselor or whatever, and they're like, hey, we're struggling with our relationship. You often think of relating as like a behavior, but why I didn't want to approach it from like, or, you know, how do I get better at, like, you know, the pickup guys? How do I get better at dating and getting more relationships, or improve my game or whatever? It's you think of behavior, or some might, I think of a behavior, but it's so much more than that. And I think when people say, well, you know, Rob, what's your are you a behavioral coach? Are you a mindset coach? Are you, and you're like, no, I'm not any one of those buckets, because the game is all of it, right?
All
like,
has
so
to work.
the game, and I say game meaning we're not, because I like to point arrows back to the fundamental shift, right? So the fundamental shift at its base allows me to see that there's a meaning that I can be in, or a meaning that I can't. And the core of that meaning, usually what I've understood is self, right? So that's where it starts. And then it goes into, if I'm in that game, it's not just, oh, I want that new behavior, that new pickup line, or, oh, that like, you know, the couples therapy technique, all those will help. But like, the real help is kind of being more conscious, being more aware of like all those little things, like with me, And because I mean, I think most people would understand I can't control you, right? I can control my behavior. And if you can't, someone can very quickly say, well, that's out of your control. So when it starts to rain and you didn't want to get wet, that's out of your control. So we can kind of all relate to that idea. But the other sense of this thing is, and we've said this on the podcast before, that like, you know, because our meaning making is part of, you know, this in our brain of self, it's you can be delusional. Like we've used that word, and I don't know if we've talked about it in the podcast, but you've talked before in your coaching about useful delusion. And the game part of it is it's not trying to prove truth and fact and reality. Because like you said, the bigger thing that can kind of help society, help the world, is like what's kind of the useful, and we say delusion, which people are like, delusion, I don't want to be delusional, but meaning we're knowing we're in those mind spaces that you're talking about, and like what's gonna be the best. So when you were saying that, I was thinking about like little kids in a preschool classroom who are playing pretend with a cardboard box, and they're in the delusion that this is their castle and they're a prince and a princess, and they're like having the time of their lives, and no one's like, oh well, you're crazy because that's a box, right? What are you doing? Like that's something that's like so encouraged as children, and imagination and its creativity, and it's like how people make art and innovate. And then it's like in our day-to-day lives, we get so locked into like reality and fact. And I think a lot of what we've talked about, at least recently on the podcast, is like, it's not about that, because truth is so subjective and there's so much meaning going on and there's so much memory and heuristics and things.
Just in a huge way, just as a blanket statement, I would argue that we are so far away from truth, stupid Zenish kind of crap that comes out of me sometimes. I mean, we're right in touch with truth. Like it's right here. But in the way that the self wants to know about it and report about it in the way that humans do, we are, it's not that nothing's true. I'm not at all saying that. It's just we deeply overestimate what's true. Right? Like we think we're better at memory. We think we perceive better than we do. We think, I mean, like here's an example, right? We are not, there's the electromagnetic spectrum, and we would all realize like, oh, I can feel an electric shock if I get shocked by something or whatever. But, no people or very few people tend to feel magnetic fields. I mean, maybe some people do a little bit or whatever, but there's argument that some animals do, that maybe that's how birds fly south. And, there might be some fish or some turtles or some bats or whatever that can actually feel these things. Right. But there's a whole like part of one of the fundamental forces that like is really magical to us. Like until we see its effect on two magnets and how it can pull across a desk, like we just don't sense that part of reality. Right. There's whole huge swaths of reality that are outside our perception entirely. And yet we stand in the middle of everything going like, we know truth, right? Like we know what we've got it. This is the final answer kind of thing. And what we find is that every time we have a final answer, there's some other detail or other perspective or other thing. And so this is not like truth doesn't matter or we shouldn't try to learn. Like all these things are incredibly valuable. The delusional part is when we're claiming knowledge that we really don't have. That gets dangerous, right? When we're believing things,
when we're stuck in suffering based off of falsehoods.
Of course. But, claims of, knowing what happens just because you believe it. And then that mistake of having that as a hard opinion, which is amazing and great and like good, but then like forcing that opinion on others or saying that you know it, right? That's where we're starting to really get into delusion. So you were talking about kids and fantasy. Every time you give yourself over to a movie, right, there's this relaxation where you literally, you're not yourself anymore. You actually, in a really meaningful way, you start to identify as the character. you're kind of modeling, like, we're interested in all these edge cases and murder mysteries and all these things that we wouldn't want to happen in real life at all.
Right.
Because we're curious to go, like, what would I do in that situation? And when we get to sort of face it, it's a really interesting way to think through some incredible, weird moral dilemma of, like, if your stepmom slept with your brother, and you're like, what do I do? Like, do I tell dad? Like, and we think we're sick for watching it, but we're trying to see and learn and kind of experience these different things, because part of that is a suspension of our life, and we get to live in a fantasy world for a little while. And that's not only entertaining, but we learn from it. And there's all these other things, right? We get to then share values in the shared space with somebody else and go, what would you do there? And, do we hold the same values, right? We can talk about, did you have a similar experience of that movie as I did? And if they didn't, you'll often, like, maybe not like them as much, right? We don't feel as aligned because that shared justification space, something's out of whack between the meaning between us, right? We're not getting along in the same way. And people will either choose, oh, well, let's just not talk about that, or, let's only talk about that and fight,
let's both leave this
Yes.
space, this mind space. Or
let's forget that and go to dinner or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
And in its best iteration, that's fine. I mean, I'm sure I have a lot of friends that if we entered a certain mental space, it wouldn't vibe as well, right? You have friends that you're like, oh, this is the person I do this with, and that's that. But that's so, like, I know we went on this big tangent of, like, we're not in reality as much as we think we are. Maybe we're capable of being much closer to reality. I would argue that that is something you can build, and you can start to know more about reality and understand what's real, what's not, et cetera. Especially if we start seeing how much our thinking is doing and how much that's altering stuff, especially if we start getting more conscious of the justification spaces, how that's affecting self, how that's affecting relating, how that's affecting all those things right now. Not because, like, those mind spaces that I might call delusional become actually the reality of life as we're consciously aware of them. Okay. So it's only a delusion when you're mistaking it for either not being there at all and it's there very much, or you're thinking it's there very much when it's not there at all, right? Like, it's that miss in it. But belief space is very, very real when it's a belief space, right? Like, it can deeply influence you, can alter so when we talk about, like, useful delusions or whatever, that might be just kind of a fun or interesting way to talk about it. But that is there is a better mindset to put on. It may or may not be true, but if I really commit to that, it motivates me and it gets me to behave differently, and it does these things. And that is going to be the best version of me I can be. That may very well be a useful delusion, right? You're exhausted running, jogging home, and instead you say, I'm just starting. I totally can do this again. I'm good, right? It's a total lie to yourself. You're not just starting. You've been running for an hour or whatever, but that can be really helpful to put on to get another half mile home and finish strong or whatever. And you can find your body changes and all these things by a useful delusion. The agreements that we make between people to have civilization, society, communities, those things are often agreements that are just decisions. They're delusions, right? So we could argue about the money system and say, the money system's an enormous delusion because they think there's value in the gold, or they think there's value in the paper or whatever. And that's a really useful abstraction because we can all exchange it and do this, but that's an agreed upon space between people that could be changed tomorrow by the powerful or by agreement amongst all of us or whatever. So there's nothing, in a sense real there, but it's incredibly real because we all decide that it matters, right? So that belief space becomes deeply real and is reality, but it's not a permanent reality like the forces of nature would be or something else, right? So well, I'm so glad that
does that make sense, or am I?
No, it totally does, and I'm so glad we got to useful delusions. It was not on my list, but it actually highlights, when I thought about relating, it actually highlights it perfectly. And here's another example. On the coaching call that you ran recently, you did an exercise where you said, imagine, if you had anything you want, what would that look like? And if you had everything taken away, what would that look like? Right. Yep. And you can also say, think about setting a goal or something, right? You do these exercises to kind of set yourself up to behave or to relate either to the other people or the world in a certain way, which is obviously a useful delusion, because you don't know, even if you plan to go and take everything that I had from me, you don't know if you could or not, right? Like it's a
and I would
not
never really
a
wish it
physical
on you.
reality.
Yeah,
Right. Or, vice versa. You don't know if I could get everything I want. But this kind of useful delusion, or this kind of meaning, even if we just talk about meaning making or the thinking self, really does control your relating.
Mm-hmm.
And I just find that like so. Rob had said to me before, I said, here's what I want to talk about today. And he said, oh, this might be interesting. We might really disagree on things in a fun way. And I said, yeah, I'm so excited to dig in, because to me, that game of relating, or that like kind of interaction with, I'll say other humans, because there's just not a lot of space in the planet Earth where you can just go be alone and interact with nature or whatever, but it could be nature, is why we get out of bed. It's why we do anything. It's why we don't want to sit in a white room all day, right? Like this is, to me, really like what I would argue almost any client that comes to you and says, hey, I'm having a problem. The problem is relational, right? It's not like, oh, when I'm alone or whatever, it involves another person or an entity or the self.
Yeah.
And if you go back to this meaning, like, okay, what meaning? So let's go back, imagine a couple sitting in therapy, right? The therapist is like, well, what meaning did you feel like when he said that? And what meaning did you feel like when she said that? He even goes back to our memories, right? Another episode of the podcast, we did a long talk on, memories and heuristics and that self-world model that we were talking about in the beginning. And those memories usually map to another relational incident. And so we all want, like, this is so motivational for us, and yet we somehow don't see that, like, it starts here.
Yeah.
And that disconnect is like, once you do see it, it feels very obvious to me, at least, like, well, you're looking at you're trying to fix the wrong thing. You're trying to fix the other person who you can't control at all.
Totally.
And you're missing how you're not even relating to like the self in a really conscious way.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's so powerful. I have so many thousands of things to say. It's hard because there's so many really, I think really important points there. Maybe we'll get into organizing some of this for next talks that we get into, because there's some real stuff I want to teach about this. And I think it's important. One thing that's interesting is there are tons of studies that show that, probably more so than really being individual at all, we're just social creatures, right? We can, children can die if they don't get touch or affection or love, right? Like literally can die from that. As little, there's almost no, and I don't want to say like I know this, but I'm pretty sure there's no real historical example of anybody truly just being born and living, immediately taken from mom and then living alone. Like you wouldn't survive, right? So, and even if you got to the point where you were old enough to survive on your own, somebody really just being like on an island alone and having that thrive through a whole life, I just don't know. I mean, maybe there's like an example of that somewhere. I'm not saying that's never happened, but it doesn't happen a lot, right? Like we are absolutely social creatures. And part of that justification system, to take this back to what people might be more familiar with, is Freud's model of superego, which is sort of that moral. If you think about morals, it's like, what's right and wrong? Like, what should I do in this group? Like, what is good to do to be a good citizen and a good person, and all that stuff. And then on the total other side of that, you have the id, which is your unconscious drives. And for Freud, that was very sexualized and aggressive and all those things. But we could think about that as the unconscious, or the impulses, or the, like you don't really control. If you see an attractive person, you just get attractive. And if you were to let your id run wild, you might just like go blah and jump on them and, do whatever you want to them. And then the management is that sort of private self in the middle, which is the ego. Right. And so that's a great model. That's Greg Enriquez has done so much great stuff in psychology, but one of the big ones is adding to that model and doing some things. And the justification system is what, a huge part of that. But what you think about where animals are much more kind of unconscious and automatic, it's almost like implied. And Dr. Paul MacLean came up with this model of like how the human brain might have evolved, very much this unconscious kind of id, brain stem, and then wrapped around that is this sort of midbrain private mind. And then we became more social as language came on and all that. And there's, okay, like we could talk about that in a lot of ways. People have disproved that some of that is useful. But if you think about the actual birth of one human being, you are in relationship with your mom or your primary caregiver or whoever's feeding you or whatever, way before there's any actual self, right? So, the child in the arm that is looking up, that is making all of its meaning from what might literally be a deity to them, right? A
glowing circle, blurry circle.
I don't really know how it's perceiving, but like that is where you're getting your food. That's where you're getting your safety. That's where you're getting corrected eventually. That's where, this is the power structure that you're in. And that is what is, in the same way that I say, when you're really looking at a tree, there's no you, there's just the tree, right? There's no you yet when you're a little guy, a little girl. There's just this that you're looking at, and there's just food. And, in a lot of ways, people say they put everything in their mouth, food and all that. I mean, they don't know what's not food at first, right? They're trying to figure it out. So anyway, all of this is to say that some of that justification stuff, some of that relating with other starts even prior to how we build ourselves. And so when we get into psychology, and, if we're trying to compete with therapy in any way, or we're trying to be the best coaching program in the world, so much of what we're dealing with are all these patterns that we took on when we were young, and we misunderstood things, and we've taken it to be true. And now it's a limit in our psyche, and all these different things that we often talk about. So many of those are relational before they are what define the self later, right? The self model gets built on top of abusive person here, critical person here, a kid that made fun of me in third grade and I felt embarrassed in the class. I noticed I could use my calculator under my table, and so I was cheating so I could look cool in class, and I got caught and deeply embarrassed, and I peed my pants, right? So now I have this deep sense of shame in my, that was so loud to me as a child. Now it's this big thing in my whole psyche growing up. That is because the self is later wrapping around so many of these experiences that we're having with other prior, because we're not even an independent thing in the beginning. We have, it's arguable 18 to maybe 29 years of what it is to actually become a full adult as a human. And so that's this amazing space that if we got better at parenting and raising kids, we'd have this enormous advantage. Like, we really should look at that and get better at that to fix all the problems in the world. It's a huge part of it. But until we do that, it's also where so many of these psychological issues come from, and why relating is so hard, why we have so many patterns in that, and how self and relating really aren't two different things. They're completely enmeshed in this one, we break up the justification space and ego or private self. And it's useful to talk about those, but in the way that we're experiencing them and doing them, they're arising together. They're messy together. Right. And that's going on. So hold that idea, because I don't want to forget one other thing that was what I thought was an important thought. When we were talking about shared delusions before, or useful delusions individually about how far you can run or not run or all those things, think about a successful marriage, right? At the highest level, the delusion there, and people say it's not a delusion, I really feel, I know you really feel that way. Okay, great. But like, the agreement between the two, the justification space that's been created is, you're my person, you're my best friend. Now, if that's happening automatically and doesn't take a lot of work, and you got lucky and you found the funny person and the smart person, you can't believe they love you, like, it's amazing. I get it, right? Like, I'm not saying any of that is fake or not real, like that. We're deeply attracted to that, and it's super important. But when the marriage is going wrong, or things like this person's grown, or this person has new sexual desires that they didn't know about before, or now trust has been broken, or different things are happening, what's required there is, and we've done this through legal means, through marriage and all these things, to create literally a shared legal structure that goes out into society. You've been in a church in front of your friends, made this huge commitment. That sets up a space of agreement between you in the world. And then between the two of you, you've got this legal thing that has everything, including financial ramifications and all these other things that are even more structured to like keep you together. But let's talk about the emotional connection part. if you can't then create a shared space where you're both really buying into and believing you really are my person and I really can trust you, and there's all these different things, then that's where the fractures happen, right? So that justification space, or shared space of agreement about what it means to be a couple, right? Like, what does it mean? What does it mean to be a family? Families that have deep values and really come together and go, hey, that's outside the family rules, or whatever those things are, they will tend to function as a family better than ones that don't, or have really disparate ones, or have addictions so that the rules are changing all the time, or deal with maybe a parent who's got mental illness and schizophrenia, and they're, the kid literally like isn't dealing with the same person at the same time. There's no consistency or structure or rules or boundaries or any kind of idea of what does it mean to be a Scott, right? What does it mean to be a Smith or a Jones or a whoever, right?
Right.
And so that can be in your friendship, right? What does it mean to be my best friend? What does it mean to be in this friend circle? And it doesn't always need to be explicitly defined, but if there's not a sense of that, if there's not people say communitas, or, some type of real shared space there, then you don't have the shared history together. Friend groups are often either people who used to go to school together, so they have all these shared memories, or they're coworkers who every day come together and have the same difficult boss or whatever, right? It's, for me, working from home at my age and with no real physical community, chances are I don't drink, I don't go to bars, I don't, it's not going to be that easy to just go find a whole new friend group, right? It's not a natural thing. So that it's because those are based around shared values, shared circumstance, shared history, shared something, right? And that's what creates these shared spaces that allow us to function together towards something, whether that's just hanging out and having fun, or whether that's a nonprofit achieving something, right? It's this, here's what we value, here's what we're moving toward, here's what's going on. And if you can do that well, you can start to coalesce and have a group. I just heard somebody talking about the difference between community and society. And I don't want to just keep introducing totally random new ideas, but the way it was described that was really interesting was community is that sort of felt sense of friendship and that history and that whole thing. You could imagine in a community, if you go to a restaurant, you could get to know the chef and you could get to know the different servers, and that starts to feel like a community. Society is different than that. Not that society can't also have restaurants or food delivery or whatever, but it doesn't have the community feel of it. It's like the structure of parts of the community, but it's been extracted, right? It's not the felt, internal sense of connection. It's just the external function of a system that kind of works together, right? And so in so many ways, we're being pulled more and more and more into a bigger society, and communities, that felt sense of togetherness and what we value and what we care about is in different ways being eroded right now. And so again, if we're not conscious of that, if we don't see that happening, we can get lost to it and things become difficult. It's like, why do I feel so lonely? And
I think a lot of people can relate to that right now as their regular physical communities maybe have been altered by being in the pandemic. But
totally.
I'm so happy that we're on this topic. I love what you just said. Going back to the first thing you said about how we start relating before we even really securely have a sense of self. I thought that was an excellent example that kind of showcases where I started, which is where I was like, I want to talk to you about relationships. And I do think we stay on this because there's lots of, now with that kind of as the foundation going forward, to talk about romantic relationships, marriage, parenting, codependency, it's a rich topic, but to kind of lay the groundwork so we can talk about those things, knowing that relating, starts before self, and then there's a way to use that skill that we have before we even know we have it. To, relate to the world, consciousness, reality, to in the terms of the fundamental shift, to relate outside, to isness, to what is, and then take that and then bring it into like, all right, now let's talk about a company,
Yeah.
let's talk about a marriage, let's talk about a family structure, because what I hope that our listeners got out of this is kind of that same breakthrough that I got, which is if you're in a situation, which I bet almost everyone is like, there's somebody that I have
Hmm.
difficulty relating to or
Yeah.
whatever, or you can't figure it out, you're in a tough marriage, or you're having a struggling at work, or your friends are fighting, or whatever that pain point or suffering point is, that there might be a different perspective that you haven't heard that can help you through it, that's not your typical how to, or say this, or mantra, or it might not be what you heard in therapy, it might
Yeah.
not be what Google says is, oh, this is what you do in this situation, you say this or do this, because it's both more simple. Like, I don't want to say it's more complex, it is maybe more complex than we can see, but it's also more simple than we realize.
Hmm.
And so I just hope this kind of illuminated that there's
Yeah.
another angle to kind of help you relate better in your relationship.
I love it. I got to say one more thing. I know I can sense that
Yeah.
you want to wrap it up. And I sometimes wish a big hook would just pull me by the neck right off, because I talk too much, and I get that. But um, I think I got a better way to talk about the thing I was joking that I said we might sort of disagree on.
Mhm.
I've heard you say, and I don't disagree with this, that the human part of us, almost everything that we want is like in or related to relationships in some way. And I really want to celebrate that, because in that stack of like what matters, it kind of is on that high end, right? Like we want to get skinny so people find us attractive. We want money so that we can be impressive to others, and we're safe and we can navigate buying things from people. Other people are the most powerful things around. I mean, until AI or whatever, like the people are the most dangerous. They're the most fruitful. They're, everything that I could ever love or have sex with or have dinner with or do anything, like it is all about other people. And one of the things that I've heard you say, and I think that we were talking about or you showed me your list, was, are people kind of what the whole thing is about? And that's the one where I wanted to disagree, but not because it's not true. Like in the human level, like
Right.
this is consciously for sure, like almost what everybody wants any of the stuff for, right? It's either to impress people or to connect to people or to parent well or to be a good child to your parents, or like that's what's hitting us in the face all the time. And it's the most complex space, right? Like, even if you're not managing yourself well, I promise that getting yourself under control is way easier than making sure other people think you're valuable and like you, because we can't get them to think differently, right? So,
Right.
and that's why those persuasion techniques and things become so valuable, because it's not authentic connecting, but it feels powerful because you can actually manipulate people and deceive them in interesting ways. And all of a sudden they feel attraction toward you that maybe they wouldn't have felt otherwise. And that, to somebody who feels not healthy, is incredibly motivating. And sadly, here's the problem: many people will choose that over some authentic connection with somebody that they could really naturally meet well and have this beautiful love thing, because they don't feel healthy enough to even.
Well, because one, they don't have to relate to self, then
Right.
they just take on a different model
Yeah,
outside.
they're trying to get and be
Yeah.
powerful and do all that stuff, and it's not about connection and sharing and all these things. So anyway, all of that is to say, I honor that, and that's very true, and that's mostly what we care about. And the other side of that is not self, not other, not anything, but isness, right? And so I would love it if we could value both of these really meaningfully. And I think the one that we're not very good at valuing, like for most of us on autopilot, it's so obvious because we start looking at mom, not even ourself, all that. We're so external to begin with. We're so motivated externally. We're so looking out here. We want more power. We want all these things that are out here. Some of the move that we've been trying to figure out in our marketing and figure out in our coaching is, how do we motivate people to actually turn that toward self-world model? But even more than that, prior to that, is this isness thing, right? And so if we could just see that on a continuum, like if isness is at the center and that's like this beating heart or a swirling, reality of truth, whatever. And then what gets wrapped around that is this self-world model. And what gets wrapped around that is the relating that we're doing, through that. The whole thing matters for sure. but they're different ends of what's going on here. And if you're lost in one, it's going to be very, very helpful to figure out the other one. And if you're only in the isness, it's, you know, you might not have the best relating skills and all that. And there's things to learn and figure out there to put on a really useful self and go relate better. So anyway, I don't know if that's helpful or not.
No,
but,
I love that you did that, because I was so curious. I was like, well, I wonder what I've been saying that we disagree.
Yeah.
And I'll counter that, but maybe not in the way that you think. And I tried to say this also on a coaching call recently, but maybe I didn't say it well. So I'll also try it again, saying it right now. I might argue that there's a slightly more importance on relating outside of self to isness, like you're saying, because what I think, and I guess I don't have the exact words to prove this, but what I've known to be true in my life, and what I've seen to be true for you in your life, is that the stuff that we think we want, like you said, all this relational stuff, it's given to us, but it's not as hard as most people think it is. It's that's why I said it's way simple, because if you can gain that relationship to isness, which is maybe just another way to say what we've been saying for the last, 40 some episodes, which is there's a different way of being. It's the fundamental shift. It literally fundamentally shifts like everything.
Yes.
You get the other stuff too. It's actually the faster path. So I guess, and you could argue, well, if you're a meditator and you sit on a rock and then you never rejoin society, like, what is that? Right. We don't want that. And we probably can't do that because we're human beings. But like, if you focus on the relationship, not with the external, and not even necessarily with, self, but the relationship with isness, you will improve your relationship with self, because you'll understand it in a completely different way, because you'll be able to objectify it, like you were saying with the mirror, right? You get to like see yourself in a different way. And thus, like, you're relating outside of self, then, like, first to isness, then to self, and then to everything else.
Let's go back to this
better.
too. Let's go back to this too. The isness includes all of it, right? Like, it's all arising out of that. And when that becomes your most meaningful relationship, right? When like, I like to say that my truest love affair is with the universe, right? Like that's really it. And even if I'm falling in love with people inside that, it's primarily because they're a part of that isness, right? That the real love affair is with this moment. It's with isness. It's with the energy underneath. And that's deeply meaningful to me and tangible. Like, it's a real thing. It's literally what we coach people to understand and do and experience. It's nothing I want you to believe in, but it's a thing that I'm trying to point to and say, hey, you can have this too. Once you have that, number one, it's always there. It can't be taken away, right? For somebody who had so many difficulties with relating and feeling unsafe and all the trust issues and all the different things, what a wonderful find for me, because this was a thing that didn't depend on others, right? This didn't depend on anything. Like, I could be alone forever. All these things of like, oh, there's so much sadness because we're not relating. Well, yeah, that's because we're not great at relating. Agreed. But it's also because we have absolutely no relationship with this moment, right? So we're this thing in the middle that's suffering and lonely and isn't good at relating and isn't good at being in isness. The thing is that if you're not aware of self, if you're not aware of what's behind self and isness in a meaningful way, the relationships are going to be based on this fake thing that you're making up that you don't even know you're making up.
Exactly.
And it's going to be based on desires that actually are kind of like smoke dragons, because even once you get them, what you thought was there, it wasn't there. And your own ability to enjoy the thing that you thought you'd be able to enjoy, like, you don't even have that skill yet. Right. So, like, all of that is a bunch of bullshit. It's a big lie. There's, if you never get to isness, first off, I'm sad for you, right? Like that, like, I want to be honest that's, maybe we should be more bold and start really claiming like how sad that is. That's a very, very sad thing. But many people don't, many people just live human lives. They're in self. They don't know they're in self, and they're doing the struggle thing. And many of them have, I'm sure, very happy lives in some way, right? That can be meaningful. I'm not crapping on that, right? But most of us, that is so much critique and struggle, and I'm not there yet, and lost in time, and all these suffering things. And that's when the movies come in and give us the story of like, well, if you just found the love of your life, if you just found the job, if you just had the breakthrough in the money, you know, and the online marketers are like, here's your breakthrough, be the millionaire or the billionaire or whatever it is now, you know, and none of those things are it, because none of those things are sincere, open, real joy. None of those things are, I mean, I'm not saying that you don't get these fleeting experiences of that,
totally.
right? But when you can have connection to isness, nothing else matters in the same way. And that might sound scary because we so are, you know, attached to what matters presently to us, but it's a freedom where, oh, my security, my confidence, my happiness, my sense of self-love, my whole, you know, the whole game is impenetrable now, right? Like it literally can't be taken from me.
Freedom is like, that's freedom in the sense of like, you know, I deeply, deeply like love my partner, and that's the person that I want to be with forever and ever. But I always say, like, the reason that I feel like I can have this kind of rich, awesome relationship that I'm just like head over heels about is because I had that with myself before I ever had it with somebody else. And I had it with myself because I could have it outside myself, right?
Yeah.
And let's, you know, imagine that we had kids, right? And we had a deep, loving relationship with our kids, which people say, hey, I want to connect with my kids and all. Like, you can have that because it all traces back, and we're fed the wrong story. Definitely, 100%. I think that, because, yeah, and just when you said freedom, it's like, you know, you don't want to do anything under you know, under a gun, right? Like, you want to do it because there's so much space to do this, and time to do this, and freedom to do this. Not because you're like, if I don't have this, I have, you know, and I guess we'll get more into lost self as we talk about other things, but like, cause you're like, if I don't have this, I lose myself. If I don't have my kids, I lose myself. If I don't have my job, I lose myself. And we see that with people. Something happens, whether they did it or it's an external factor or whatever. And it's like the whole tower comes crumbling down. And that's what I think you mean when you're like, this gives you freedom, right? It changes your relationship. It gives me freedom in my relationship to feel secure and confident, and all those things that people say, like, these are the things that I want. You know, how do I get them? And we like kind of point to isness, like, it's isness. Oh, that's isness too. But it really is like, I will just continually be a cheerleader for isness because it is like, it does a lot.
So it's funny because, you know, I'm you know, I really want this to be useful wherever someone is and what they need to hear. And there are these incredible tools out in relating. And so I think it's important to go, relating matters for sure. Like, you're in a bunch of relationships, being able to figure that out is really important. Isness might not make sense to you, all that stuff. So I don't want to, you know, in that moment oversell it. And then you come back with, but hey, I'm going to argue for isness. Like, I don't know if you're going to agree with me, Rob. And I'm hearing you do that. And I'm like, well, no, but of course I agree. Like, what do you mean? Like, you know me, right? Like, this is, I will go hard in the paint, you know, for that. And here's the thing too, a lot of this has to do with knowing, and, you know, we end up holding on to things and thinking we know. Don't think you know what we mean. You know, don't just put this in. Oh, they're talking about meditation again. I know what that is, or whatever. This is so subtle. You know, we did just have that coaching call with people, and people that know a lot about this and have breakthroughs all the time and all that stuff end up in a conversation with me. In the middle of the sentence, I can be like, hey, are you seeing what you're doing right now? And it's this, we're adding this whole extra stuff on. We've left isness. We don't know we've done it. And it's almost like it's happening to us.
It's very unconscious.
Right? It's happening to us. And there's a sense here where oftentimes we talk about this, and this is happening, and this is bad, and all these things. You know, the quote unquote bad that's coming, or the dysfunction that's coming, it's not because anyone was like necessarily this horrible thing. It's not like there's this huge plan behind the scenes to, you know, yes, there are marketers that would love to keep us just as buying machines and unconscious. Like, there are motivations towards that in some ways, right? I'm not going to say there's nothing like that going on, but the level of unconscious that I'm talking about, it's in the system, like it's in the thought system, and it's really our work now. It's our job as humans to see everything that we're great at, right? Everything that thought has afforded us and all these different things and the money system and all the wonderful things, right? All the tech, all the medicine that we get, all these things. And then also really look at what's dysfunctional and what we're not great at yet. And the reason that I think this is literally the foundational thing, the fundamental thing that we need to begin with, is this exposing how bad we are at seeing how much thinking is like altering stuff and how we're just unconscious to that, right? It's just literally invisible to us. And I know that we're talking about relating. That is at the heart of all the relationship problems that we have too. Because if you can end up knowing somebody that has any access to doing less of that and to being more conscious of seeing how their own perceptions are affecting things and all that, that is your real ability to truly be with somebody in an intimate way where you really know them, they get to really know you. And that's where we're talking about real intimacy, real love. And I don't mean it has to be romantic or anything like that, but like a real, like, oh my God, like I so value this person. I so like, look at this other unique conscious being that's in the same struggle I am. Like, now I want to know everything. How do you see it? What's going on? This conversation's become deeply interesting. Like, it's a whole nother level of relating. And we're capable of this. We can all get just a little bit better at this. I'm going to suggest we can all get monstrously better at this. And as we
isn't
do
that why it's so intimate for an infant and a mother, going back to that idea of where we're relating? And you feel all this, like, you know, you just close connection and, you know, talking about bonding and then it's not that way with, like, you know, your 30-year-old child. Right. Yeah, and you're like, well, I don't know what happened, but it's like, that's there's something so intimate about that you can, I would guarantee, whether it's not, you know, maybe it's like a puppy or something. There's this innocence when you're not in that, like, kind of thought trap where you can amazing. Really be intimate with something or someone.
With a baby, there's definitely chemicals that are happening there because of, you know, there's other things online for sure, but that connection with a child, like in just having a regular conversation. I love how you mentioned a pet, right? Like, hang out with a dog, and people might be like, I hate dogs or whatever, but like, all right, if you just hang with a dog and really like connect, there's this incredible, like, the dog is in the present, right? The dog isn't doing all this extra modeling. There's just really, you know, root motivations and hungers and playfulness, or maybe a little anger or whatever, but there's this sincerity of being with the dog. And I think that is at the heart of the people that are just crazy about dogs and love them and feel so close. And, you know, this is my baby too, whatever, you know, they're not bringing on this fakery, these motivations, these manipulations that, and we will definitely talk more about this, that happen to us as we feel separate and we're faking relating rather than really relating, et cetera. So anyway, I think we've beat this up for today. We got a ton to come back to. This is a really, really rich topic. And
thanks for getting into this with me.
Oh my God, I love it. Thank you so much. This is one of my fun ones. I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for listening. Be kind to yourself. And guess what? Everybody else, go have fun. All right. We'll talk to you in the next one. Bye-bye.